The night my parents threw me out, it was raining so hard the porch light turned the water white. I was 16, standing there with one suitcase, one shaking hand over my stomach, and my mother pointing at the door like she was afraid I might still belong to her if she let me stay 1 second longer. She didn't scream. That would have been easier to understand. She just looked at me with that cold, careful face and said, "If you walk out with this disgrace, don't come back." I remember the sound my father's pen made behind her, still moving across paper at the dining room table, like disowning me was just one more thing to finish before bed. I remember my brother upstairs. My sister, too. Neither of them came down. And I remember thinking, in that strange calm that sometimes comes right before your whole life breaks open, that the baby inside me was already being blamed for existing. 20 years later, those same parents stood on my front porch smiling, asking to meet the grandson they had already bragged about to half of Portland. The only problem was this: I never had a son, and what they found inside my house that evening did not make them proud. It made them look at the ruins of everything they had spent a lifetime trying to protect. My name is Grace Meyers. I'm 36 years old, and for most of my life, I thought the worst thing my parents ever did was throw me out when I was pregnant in the 10th grade. I was wrong. The worst thing they did was teach me, long before that night, that love could be withdrawn the moment you became inconvenient. Back in 2004, my family looked perfect from the outside. My father, Richard Meyers, owned a respected real estate law practice in Portland. My mother, Diane, ran charity committees, church dinners, school fundraisers, and every room she entered. We sat in the front pew every Sunday, dressed in soft colors she picked out the night before, like we were an ad for moral success. But inside our house, love had ranking. My older brother Nathan was the future. My sister Carolyn was the pride. And I was the surprise child who arrived too late and fit nowhere. Nobody said that directly. Families like mine rarely do. They bury cruelty under good manners. They call neglect discipline. They call favoritism high standards. They make you feel unwanted so quietly you spend years wondering if maybe you imagined it. So, when I met Marcus Webb at the downtown library and he asked me, "Are you okay?" it felt like someone had opened a window in a room I didn't know I was suffocating in. And if you already know what it's like to be treated like the extra child, the difficult child, the one people make smaller to stay comfortable, subscribe and stand for dignity. Stories like this are for the people who had to find their worth the hard way. The first time Marcus spoke to me, I was sitting on the floor of the biography aisle at the downtown library pretending to study. In reality, I was trying not to cry. My mother had forgotten to pick me up from school again. Not the first time, not even the third that month. By then I had already learned that if I called the house to remind her, she would sound annoyed as if my needing a ride was the real inconvenience. So I started taking the bus downtown and waiting at the library until dinner time. The library was quiet in a way my house never was. No expectations, no comparisons, no careful glances measuring whether I was behaving like a proper Meyers daughter. Just books and the soft hum of fluorescent lights. That afternoon I was reading about Eleanor Roosevelt when Marcus sat down across from me like it was the most normal thing in the world. "You okay?" he asked. I remember blinking at him because the question felt unfamiliar. Marcus went to Jefferson High, the public school my parents talked about the way some people talk about crime statistics. He worked afternoons at his uncle's auto repair shop and came to the library afterward to finish homework before closing. He had grease on his hands sometimes. He laughed too easily. And he listened in a way that made you feel like your words actually mattered. We started meeting there a few afternoons a week, not officially dating at first, just talking between homework assignments. Marcus never asked why I flinched when my phone rang. He never asked why I stayed at the library until almost closing. He just kept showing up. Looking back now, I think that's what trust often looks like at 16, not big declarations. Just someone quietly choosing you, again and again. By October, we were officially together, though the word secret hung over everything. My parents would never have approved of Marcus. Not because he was unkind. Not because he was irresponsible. but because he came from the wrong world. And families like mine care about worlds more than they care about people. The day I found out I was pregnant was a gray Thursday morning at a gas station bathroom, 3 miles from school. 2 pink lines. My hands shook so hard I had to sit on the floor. When I told Marcus later that afternoon, we were sitting in his uncle's truck behind the repair shop. The air smelled like motor oil and rain. He didn't panic. He didn't blame me. He just held both my hands and said quietly, "We'll figure this out together, Grace." It sounds simple now. But when you're 16 and terrified, those words can feel like oxygen. Of course, some of you listening already know what happens next. You know the moment a secret becomes too big to hide. You know the weight of deciding whether to tell the people who are supposed to love you the most. So I decided I would tell my parents at Sunday dinner. I thought honesty might soften the blow. I was very wrong. And before we go further, I'm curious about something. Some of you listening right now probably grew up in families where reputation mattered more than reality. Where mistakes weren't something you worked through together, they were something that could ruin everything. If that sounds familiar, tell me where you're listening from tonight. Drop your city below. Sometimes the quietest listeners carry the heaviest stories. Because what happened at that dinner table 3 days later didn't just change my life. It erased me from my family completely. Sunday dinner in our house always happened at exactly 7:30. Not 7:25, not 7:35. My mother believed routine reflected discipline, and discipline reflected character. The dining table was always set with the good plates, even on ordinary weekends. My father carved the meat. My brother and sister updated everyone on their progress like small presentations. Nathan talked about dental school. Carolyn talked about her education classes, and I usually talked as little as possible. That night, the roast beef was overcooked. I remember that detail for no real reason except that I kept staring at it, trying to find the courage to speak while my heart hammered against my ribs. I had practiced the words all afternoon. I'm pregnant. Simple. Direct. Honest. But the moment kept stretching longer. My father was talking about a zoning dispute with one of his clients. My mother was already planning the church Christmas gala and discussing which families would be invited to sit at the head table. No one noticed how quiet I was. Finally, I cleared my throat. I have something to tell you. 4 faces turned toward me. My father stopped cutting his meat. Nathan leaned back in his chair. Carolyn frowned slightly. My mother folded her napkin in half like she always did before listening to something serious. "What is it, Grace?" she asked. I took one breath. "I'm pregnant." The fork slipped out of my mother's hand and hit the plate with a sharp sound that still echoes in my memory. My father didn't move at first. Then he slowly set down his knife. "Who is the father?" he asked. His voice wasn't angry yet. It was colder than that. "His name is Marcus," I said. "Marcus Webb." Silence. "Does he attend St. Catherine's?" my mother asked quickly. "No, Jefferson High." The shift in the room was instant. Jefferson might as well have been another country. "What does his father do?" my father asked. "He lives with his uncle. He works at an auto shop." 11 seconds passed. I counted them. Then my father stood up. "You will not keep it." My mother inhaled sharply. "Richard, she will not destroy everything we've built." He wasn't looking at me anymore. He was looking past me, like I had already become a problem to remove. "I'm not getting rid of my baby," I said quietly. The words felt enormous leaving my mouth. My father's eyes snapped back to mine. "Then you are no longer part of this family." The sentence landed in the center of the room like something heavy breaking through glass. Nathan shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Carolyn stared at her plate. My mother stood up slowly. "Grace," she said carefully, "you need to understand the consequences of the choices you're making." "I do understand," I said. For the first time that night, my voice stopped shaking. "I'm choosing my child." What happened next moved quickly. Too quickly for a 16-year-old girl to fully understand what was happening. But by 9:15 that night, I was standing outside our front door with one suitcase and rain soaking through my sweater. My mother opened the door. She didn't hug me. She didn't cry. She simply pointed to the steps. Leave. And before the door closed behind me, my father's voice floated down the hallway one last time. Reputation takes 20 years to build, Grace, he said. And 5 minutes to destroy. At 16, I thought I was the 5 minutes. I didn't realize until much later that sometimes the truth only takes 5 minutes to undo a lie. And if you're still here listening to this story unfold, stay with me. Because the night didn't end on that porch. 20 minutes later, under a flickering gas station light 3 blocks away, someone showed up who refused to let me disappear. The rain followed me all the way down Mulberry Street. By the time I reached the gas station on the corner, my hair was soaked, and the suitcase felt twice as heavy as when I'd carried it out of the house. I stood under the buzzing fluorescent lights of the payphone, staring at the numbers on the keypad like they might disappear if I blinked too long. Marcus picked up on the second ring. Grace? His voice was warm and steady, the way it always was. Something inside me cracked. They kicked me out, I whispered. There was a short pause. Not confusion. Not hesitation. Just the sound of him breathing in slowly. Where are you? The gas station on Mulberry. I'm coming, he said. Stay right there. The line went dead. I sat on the curb and wrapped my arms around my stomach. The rain kept dripping from the edge of the gas station roof, tapping against the pavement in a steady rhythm. 16 years old. Pregnant. Homeless. It sounds dramatic when you say it out loud now. But that night, it didn't feel dramatic. It felt strangely quiet. Like my life had been dropped into a different story without warning. 20 minutes later, a rusty pickup truck pulled into the lot with a loud squeal of brakes. Marcus jumped out before it had even fully stopped. He ran straight toward me. Hey, he said softly, pulling his jacket around my shoulders. Hey, I've got you. That was the first time I cried that night. Not on the porch. Not walking through the rain. But standing there with someone who refused to look at me like I had ruined everything. Marcus's uncle was driving. A tall man named Luis Webb with tired eyes and a gentle voice. He looked at Marcus, then at me, then at the suitcase by my feet. You're coming with us, he said simply. We drove through Portland's wet streets in silence for a while. Marcus held my hand the whole time. I remember watching the streetlights blur through the rain and thinking that the world looked the same even though everything in my life had changed in one evening. Luis finally spoke as we stopped at a red light. You got somewhere safe to stay, kid? I shook my head. Before Marcus could answer, another voice appeared in my memory. Mrs. Margaret Torres. She lived 3 houses down from my parents' house, a retired school teacher who wore bright scarves and always waved when I walked home from school. For reasons I still can't fully explain, I suddenly said her name. Maybe Mrs. Torres. Luis nodded once. Let's try. When we pulled up to her small blue house, the rain had softened into a quiet mist. It was nearly 10 at night. Marcus walked beside me up the short path to her door. I knocked twice. The porch light flicked on almost immediately. When Mrs. Torres opened the door, she didn't ask many questions. She looked at my wet hair, the suitcase, Marcus standing beside me, and the way I was holding my stomach. Her eyes softened instantly. Oh, sweetheart, she said. She stepped aside and opened the door wider. You can stay here. Just like that. No judgment. No speeches. Just a warm kitchen light and the smell of cinnamon tea drifting from inside. Marcus squeezed my hand gently. And sometimes, when the world closes a door so loudly it echoes for years, another one opens quietly in a place you never expected. 2 weeks later, Marcus and I were packing that same suitcase again. Only this time, we weren't running from something. We were trying to build a life. But the truth is, we had no idea how hard that life was about to become. And if you're still here listening, there's something important I want to say before we keep going. Real strength doesn't shout. It grows quietly in moments like this. If you believe in that kind of quiet strength, subscribe. because the hardest chapters of this story hadn't even started yet. For 2 weeks, Marcus and I lived in Mrs. Torres's small guest room. It wasn't much, just a narrow bed, a wooden dresser, and a window that looked out over her backyard garden, but to me it felt safer than any room I had ever slept in before. Every morning, Mrs. Torres made oatmeal and tea. She never asked me to explain everything. She never asked why my parents had done what they did. She just treated me like someone worth protecting. Sometimes kindness is like that, quiet, steady, not dramatic enough to make headlines, but strong enough to keep someone from falling apart. Marcus spent those 2 weeks making phone calls, asking everyone he knew about work and cheap apartments. His uncle Luis helped where he could, but money was tight for everyone. We had exactly $300 between us. $300 to start a life. One evening, Marcus came back into the kitchen holding a small, folded piece of paper like it was something fragile. "I found something," he said. It was a studio apartment above a laundromat in Seattle. $425 a month. The building smelled like bleach and hot metal dryers, but the landlord was willing to overlook our ages if Marcus signed the lease and promised to keep up with rent. We said yes before he could change his mind. Leaving Portland felt strange. Not dramatic, not emotional, just final. I didn't go back to my parents' house. I didn't try to collect anything I had left behind. There was nothing there anymore that belonged to me. 3 days after we arrived in Seattle, a certified letter showed up at the apartment mailbox. My father had always been very efficient. Inside the envelope were 3 pages of legal language. Typed. Notarized. Signed. The document declared that Grace Elizabeth Meyers voluntarily forfeited any claim to the Meyers family estate, and that Richard and Diane Meyers bore no legal or moral responsibility for her future welfare. One sentence stayed burned in my memory, including any dependents thereof. Dependents. That was how my unborn child was described. Not a granddaughter. Not a human being. Just a legal possibility my parents wanted erased. I folded the papers carefully and placed them inside a small box under the bed. For years afterward, I carried those documents everywhere we moved. Not because I planned to use them, but because they reminded me of something important. You can't pretend someone was never there if the truth is written down. Seattle slowly became our new beginning. Marcus worked double shifts at an auto shop in Ballard. I studied for my GED while my stomach grew rounder each week. We ate cheap noodles, day-old bread from a bakery down the street, and sometimes shared one pizza for 2 days. It wasn't glamorous, but it was ours. On July 6, 2005, my daughter was born at Harborview Medical Center. 7 pounds, 4 ounces, 10 fingers, 10 toes. Marcus held her first and whispered, "Hey there, Lily." Lily Grace Meyers Webb. She had his brown eyes and my stubborn chin, and the moment I held her against my chest, I made a promise no one else heard. No one will ever make you feel like you shouldn't exist. For a while, life was just survival. Work. Diapers. Bills. Sleep when we could get it. But some of you listening probably know that season well. When you're so busy keeping your head above water that you don't even realize you're slowly becoming stronger. Still, the hardest moment of my life wasn't the night my parents threw me out. It came 5 years later. On a rainy afternoon in March, and it arrived in the form of a knock on my apartment door. The police officer standing outside my apartment door that afternoon looked like he wished he didn't have to be there. That's the first thing I remember. His hat was wet from the rain. His hands were folded awkwardly in front of him. And when he asked, "Are you Grace Webb?" something deep inside me already knew the world was about to tilt again. Marcus had been driving home from a night shift. Aurora Avenue. A delivery truck ran a red light. "He died on impact," the officer said quietly. I didn't cry at first. I just stared past him at the gray hallway behind his shoulders, while Lily played with a stuffed rabbit on the living room floor, humming softly to herself. Marcus was 26 years old. The life insurance policy from his job paid out $12,000. $12,000. That was the official value of a good man's life according to paperwork. I was 22 years old. A widow in everything but paperwork. A single mother with a 4-year-old child and a kitchen drawer full of unpaid bills. There's a moment after something like that happens when the world becomes painfully quiet. Friends say they're sorry. Neighbors bring casseroles. But eventually everyone goes back to their lives. And you're left standing there wondering how you're supposed to build a future out of ashes. For me, the answer came slowly. Work. Before Marcus died, I had been helping neighbors decorate apartments, rearranging furniture, painting walls, staging small homes for real estate agents who couldn't afford professional designers. Nothing official. Just small jobs. But people kept telling me the same thing. You have an eye for this, Grace. After the funeral, I threw myself into that work like oxygen. While Lily napped, I sketched room layouts at the kitchen table. At night, after she fell asleep, I studied design books from the public library. The same library where I had met Marcus years earlier. Sometimes survival doesn't look heroic. Sometimes it looks like staying up past midnight with a measuring tape and a notebook because failure simply isn't an option anymore. Those years were hard. But they built something inside me that no one could take away. Determination. The quiet kind. And if you've ever had to rebuild your life after losing the person who helped you carry it, you understand exactly what I mean. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight. Stories travel farther than we think. And sometimes the people who need to hear them are sitting in the quietest rooms. The first time someone paid me real money for my design work, it was $200. Not 2,000. 200. The apartment belonged to a young couple who had just moved into a cramped one-bedroom above a grocery store in Capitol Hill. The place was cluttered, the lighting was terrible, and the living room felt smaller than it really was. But when I finished rearranging the furniture, adding soft lamps, and hanging a few inexpensive prints, the whole space changed. The wife walked in, stopped in the doorway, and whispered, "It feels like home now." That moment stayed with me. Because for the first time since Marcus died, I realized something important. Maybe the thing I was good at wasn't decorating. Maybe it was helping people feel safe inside their own spaces. Over the next 2 years, small jobs turned into steady work. Real estate agents started calling me to stage properties before showings. Neighbors recommended me to friends. I worked during the day while Lily was in preschool, then came home to cook dinner, help with puzzles, read bedtime stories, and fall asleep on the couch from exhaustion. It wasn't glamorous, but slowly something was growing. In 2012, everything changed again. I enrolled in a weekend interior design workshop at Seattle Central College because the class fee was discounted and I wanted to learn how professionals actually approach the work I had been doing instinctively. That's where I met Eleanor Vance. She walked into the room wearing a long charcoal coat and carrying herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent decades being listened to. Later, I learned she had been the creative director of a major design firm before retiring. During the workshop, she studied my portfolio photos of small apartments, staged living rooms, before and after sketches I kept in a worn binder. She flipped through every page slowly. Then she looked up and said something I had never heard from anyone outside my small circle of friends. "You have real talent." I laughed nervously. "I just move furniture around." "No," she said gently. "You see how people live. That's different. Sometimes one sentence from the right person can change the direction of your entire life." Eleanor became my mentor that year. She helped me apply for small business loans, introduced me to suppliers, and taught me the business side of design I had never understood before. Looking back now, I realize something. Every time my life seemed to collapse, someone unexpected appeared to help me rebuild it. Mrs. Torres, Marcus, Eleanor. People who weren't family by blood, but who chose to show up anyway. And that realization would matter more than I understood at the time. Because 20 years after the night I was thrown out of my parents' house, the past I thought was buried would come knocking on my door again. The night my parents showed up at my door again, I almost didn't recognize them. Not because 20 years had changed their faces, but because for 2 decades they had existed only as ghosts in my memory. And ghosts aren't supposed to ring your doorbell. It was a Tuesday evening in early November. I had just returned from a client meeting on Mercer Island, an $800,000 renovation project that would have been unimaginable during those ramen noodle years in Seattle. My company, Hearth and Home Interiors, now had 22 employees. My daughter Lily was 19 and studying psychology at the University of Washington. Life had become stable, quiet, earned. I turned onto my street just after sunset and saw the black Mercedes parked in front of my house. 2 figures stood on the porch. Even from the car, something inside me knew. My hands tightened around the steering wheel. Richard Meyers, Diane Meyers, my parents. 20 years of silence, and suddenly they were standing outside the life I had built without them. I sat in the car for almost a full minute before getting out. Old instincts whispered that I should leave. Drive away. Pretend I hadn't seen them. But I wasn't 16 anymore. I walked up the driveway slowly. My father spoke first. "Grace," he said, looking me up and down like he was evaluating a property listing. "You look, well." That word hung between us awkwardly. Well, as if the past 20 years were a performance review he hadn't expected to pass. "What are you doing here?" I asked. My mother stepped forward, her posture still perfectly straight, her hair the same careful shade of blonde she'd worn most of my childhood. "We know about your son," she said. The sentence made no sense at first. "My... what?" "Your son," my father repeated calmly. "Our grandson." I stared at them. Because the truth was very simple. I didn't have a son. I had Lily. And suddenly I understood something. They hadn't come because they missed me. They hadn't come to apologize. They had come for a reason. The kind of reason that only appears when reputation is at stake. My father opened his briefcase and pulled out a check. Blank. He placed it gently on my coffee table after I let them inside. $250,000, he said. "All we ask is that you bring your son to our anniversary celebration next week." The room felt very still. 20 years of silence. Now a price. Some of you listening have probably experienced a moment like that, when people who once rejected you suddenly return once they believe you've become useful again. And when that happens, you realize something powerful. Respect that comes late is rarely real. But stay with me. Because the truth about that grandson they wanted so badly was about to unravel everything. When my father placed the blank check on my coffee table, he did it the same way he used to place legal documents in front of clients. Calm. Precise. Confident the numbers would settle the conversation. 250,000, he repeated. You attend the anniversary party with your son, stay for a few photos, and everyone moves forward. Everyone moves forward. The way he said it made it sound like the last 20 years had been a minor misunderstanding. I didn't touch the check. Instead, I looked at the 2 people sitting in my living room, the same people who had once stood in a warm doorway while I stood outside in the rain. "What makes you think I have a son?" I asked. My mother gave a small smile. "We read the article about your business. It mentioned your child. We assumed." "You assumed the child was a boy." My father nodded slightly. "Well, yes. Naturally the Meyers name." He stopped when he saw my expression. "The truth is they hadn't come because they cared about me. They had come because my mother had already told half their church, the Rotary Club, and every one of their social circles about their brilliant grandson. A grandson who didn't exist. The entire story had been built from a single line in a magazine article she hadn't bothered to read carefully. Now the anniversary party was approaching. 200 guests. Important people. And they needed that imaginary grandson to appear. Otherwise, their story would collapse. So they came to buy one. "You think I'd bring a child into that room just to help you maintain a lie?" I asked quietly. My father's voice hardened slightly. "Grace, you're being dramatic. This is simply about family appearances." "Family appearances." Some of you listening already know that phrase. It's the one people use when truth becomes inconvenient. Before I could respond, footsteps sounded from the staircase behind me. "Mom?" Lily's voice called. "Is everything okay?" She walked into the living room wearing sweatpants and a University of Washington hoodie, her hair tied up in a messy ponytail from studying. 19 years old. My entire world. My mother looked at her, then back at me. Confusion slowly spread across her face. "Grace," she said slowly. "Who is that?" I stood up. "This," I said calmly, "is Lily. My daughter." The silence that followed was so thick you could almost feel it in the air. Because in that moment, the imaginary grandson my parents had promised the world became a very real granddaughter standing in front of them. And if you understand the kind of quiet strength it takes to face people who once erased you, real power moves in silence. Subscribe. Because what Lily said next changed the entire night. My mother stared at Lily like someone trying to solve a puzzle that had suddenly changed shape. For 20 years, the story she had told the world was simple. Her youngest daughter had gone abroad, started a new life somewhere far away. And somewhere along the way, that daughter had apparently produced a grandson who would one day continue the Meyers name. It was a neat story. Respectable. Predictable. But standing in my living room was a 19-year-old college student in a University of Washington hoodie. And she wasn't a grandson. She was a granddaughter. Lily looked at the two strangers carefully. Then she turned to me. "These are them, right?" she asked quietly. I nodded. "The grandparents who threw you out when you were pregnant with me?" My mother flinched like someone had snapped a rubber band in the air. "That's not exactly—" "Actually," Lily said calmly, "that's exactly what happened." My father stood slowly. His lawyer instincts were already recalculating the situation. "Well," he said stiffly, "a granddaughter works just as well." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was so painfully predictable. "We can adjust the narrative," he continued. "You were studying abroad. Lily recently returned. A wonderful reunion story." Lily crossed her arms. "I was born in Seattle," she said. "I've lived here my whole life." My mother's voice softened, trying to regain control of the moment. "You could help us fix this misunderstanding." "Fix it?" Lily repeated. "You mean, lie." The room went very quiet again. Some of you listening probably recognize this moment. The moment when the younger generation refuses to carry the silence the older one depended on. Lily had grown up knowing the truth. I never hid it from her. Not the rain. Not the letter. Not the years my parents pretended we didn't exist. And that honesty had given her something my parents didn't understand. Clarity. "You spent 20 years pretending my mom disappeared," Lily said slowly. "And now, you want me to help you pretend again?" My father glanced at the blank check still sitting on the table. "This is a generous offer," he said. "For 3 hours of your time." Lily didn't even look at the money. Instead, she looked directly at them. "You couldn't handle the truth when my mom was 16, she said. "So now you're trying to buy a better version of it." Then she stepped closer to me and quietly took my hand. That small gesture meant more than any speech ever could. Because sometimes the strongest thing a family can do is simply stand together. And before I tell you what happened the following week at my parents' anniversary party where 200 people were about to hear a truth they never expected, let me say something quickly. If you believe dignity should never be for sale, subscribe and stand for dignity. Because what happened at that celebration didn't destroy a family. It revealed one. After my parents left that night, the house felt strangely quiet. Not peaceful. Just heavy. Like the past had walked through the door, sat on the couch for a while, and then left behind a weight that hadn't existed that morning. Lily and I sat at the kitchen table long after the headlights of their Mercedes disappeared down the street. Neither of us spoke for a while. Finally, she asked the question I had been avoiding. "Are you going to their party?" I stared at the surface of the table, tracing the grain of the wood with my finger. "I don't know yet." That wasn't completely true. Part of me already knew. Because for 20 years my parents had controlled the story. To their friends, to their church, to their community. Grace went abroad. Grace started a life somewhere else. Grace disappeared. But the truth had never disappeared. It had simply been quiet. And quiet truths have a strange way of waiting for the right moment to be heard. Lily leaned back in her chair. They think they can still manage the narrative, she said. That's how people like them survive. She wasn't angry, just clear. Some of you listening probably understand that feeling too when you realize the story people tell about you isn't the one you actually lived. I stood up and walked to the hallway closet. From the top shelf, I pulled down a small fireproof lockbox. Inside were the documents I had carried through every apartment, every move, every chapter of my life. The notarized letter, the signatures, the line that erased me, and any dependence thereof. Lily read the first page slowly. They really did it, she whispered. Yes, I said. And they spent 20 years pretending they hadn't. She looked up at me. So what are you going to do? For the first time since my parents had knocked on my door, the answer came clearly. I'm not going to fight them, I said. I'm going to tell the truth. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to stay invisible. The next morning, I made a phone call I hadn't made in almost a year. Margaret Torres answered on the third ring. Grace? She said warmly. Sweetheart, is everything all right? Just hearing her voice brought back the memory of a rainy porch 20 years earlier, and a door opening when I had nowhere else to go. I need to ask you something, I said. And slowly, carefully, I told her everything. About my parents showing up. About the imaginary grandson. About the anniversary party with 200 guests. There was a long silence on the other end of the phone. Then Mrs. Torres let out a soft sigh. Those people, she said quietly, 20 years later and they still haven't learned anything. I hesitated before asking the question that had been circling my mind all night. Mrs. Torres, do you remember that night? The night they threw me out? Her answer came immediately. I remember every minute of it. She told me she had been standing at her living room window when she saw me on the porch. The rain. The suitcase. The way the front door closed behind me. I watched you stand there for nearly 10 minutes before you walked away, she said gently. I've never forgotten that. My heart tightened. Then I asked the question that changed everything. Did you still have your old security camera footage from that year? There was another pause. You know, she said slowly, I never delete anything. 20 minutes later, my phone buzzed with an email. A grainy image filled the screen. A 16-year-old girl standing on a porch in the rain. Time-stamped. November 14th, 2004. Proof. I stared at the photo for a long time. Because sometimes the truth waits quietly for years, until someone finally asks to see it. And in that moment I realized something important. If my parents wanted a perfect story for their anniversary celebration, they were about to get the real one instead. And if you've ever learned that the truth has a way of resurfacing no matter how deeply people bury it, you understand why this moment mattered. 3 days before my parents' anniversary party, my phone rang with a number I hadn't seen in 20 years. Nathan. My older brother. For a moment I just stared at the screen, my thumb hovering above the answer button. The last time I had seen him, he was standing at an upstairs window watching while I stood in the rain with a suitcase. I finally answered. Hello? His voice sounded older. Not just deeper. Heavier. Grace, it's Nathan. There was a long silence. Then he exhaled slowly. I know I probably don't deserve you picking up that call. I leaned back in my chair but didn't interrupt. I should have come downstairs that night, he said. I should have said something. His voice cracked slightly. I didn't, and I've been living with that for 20 years. Apologies are strange things. Sometimes they arrive decades too late. Sometimes they still matter. I'm not calling to defend Mom and Dad, he continued. I'm calling to warn you. That caught my attention. Warn me about what? The party. He paused again. They're planning a big family moment during the speeches. Pastor Harrison is live streaming it on the church Facebook page. A live stream. 200 guests in the ballroom. And an audience online. Nathan continued. Mom told everyone about your son. I almost laughed. Yes, I said quietly. I heard about that. Grace, he said carefully. Caroline and I both know the truth. And if you show up, you won't be alone. I looked out the window at the Seattle skyline. For years I had imagined this moment, someone from my family finally admitting what happened. Not defending it. Just acknowledging it. Sometimes healing doesn't begin with forgiveness. Sometimes it begins with someone finally saying, I saw what happened. Before hanging up, Nathan said one more thing. Whatever you're planning, just know, the truth deserves to be heard. After the call ended, I sat quietly for a long time. The anniversary party was 3 days away. 200 people, a live stream, and a story my parents had carefully protected for 2 decades. Some of you listening probably know that moment when you realize the truth is about to step into the light. And once it does, there's no putting it back in the dark. The ballroom at the Heathman Hotel looked exactly the way my mother would have designed it. Crystal chandeliers, white linen tablecloths, tall arrangements of ivory roses placed perfectly at the center of every table. Nearly 200 guests filled the room, dressed in suits and evening dresses, holding glasses of champagne and smiling politely at the couple celebrating 50 years of marriage. From the outside, it looked like the perfect life, the perfect family, the perfect story. Lily and I stood quietly near the entrance for a moment before walking in. She squeezed my hand. You okay? She whispered. I nodded slowly. I'm ready. Across the room, my parents stood near the stage, greeting guests. My father looked confident, shaking hands with business partners and church members. My mother's smile moved easily from table to table, the same practiced expression she had worn my entire childhood. They hadn't noticed us yet, but the room was beginning to shift. A few people turned their heads. A few whispers passed from one table to another. Recognition spreads quickly in rooms like that. Finally, my mother looked up. The moment she saw me, her smile froze. My father followed her gaze, and suddenly the room felt very quiet. I didn't rush. I walked slowly through the crowd with Lily beside me. Not angry, not shaking, just steady. Because this wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. Some of you listening might understand that difference. Revenge tries to destroy someone. Truth simply refuses to stay hidden. When I reached the stage, my father was already holding the microphone, halfway through his speech. Family has always been the foundation of everything Diane and I have built, he was saying. I stepped up onto the platform. 200 pairs of eyes turned toward me. My father stopped speaking. Grace, he said stiffly. What a surprise. I gently took the microphone from his hand. And for the first time in 20 years, I introduced myself to the room. My name is Grace Meyers, I said. I'm Richard and Diane's youngest daughter. The silence that followed felt like the entire building had stopped breathing. Because the daughter who had supposedly disappeared abroad was standing right in front of them. And the story they had told for 2 decades was about to change forever. For a moment, no one in the ballroom moved. 200 people stood frozen with champagne glasses in their hands, watching a woman they had heard about for years, but had never actually seen. I could hear the faint hum of the live stream camera near the stage. Somewhere online, people were already watching. My parents have told many of you that I moved abroad 20 years ago, I continued calmly. A few heads in the audience nodded. That story isn't true. The room shifted uneasily. On November 14, 2004, when I was 16 years old and pregnant, my parents asked me to leave their home. You could feel the shock ripple through the crowd. A woman near the front covered her mouth. My father stepped toward me. Grace, this isn't. I held up a hand gently. When is the right time to tell the truth, Dad? He stopped. So I reached into my bag and pulled out the document I had carried for 2 decades. 3 pages. Typed. Notarized. Signed, "This is the letter my parents sent me 3 days after they threw me out," I said, holding it up. It officially removed me and any child I might have from the Meyers family. Someone in the crowd gasped. Because written truth has a weight that rumors never do. Behind me, Lily stepped onto the stage. She stood beside me quietly. Strong. Unapologetic. "My parents told many of you they have a grandson," I said. "They even offered me $250,000 last week to bring him here tonight." A murmur swept across the room. I rested my hand on Lily's shoulder. "The grandson they promised you doesn't exist." My voice stayed steady. "But this young woman does." Lily looked directly into the crowd. "I'm Lily," she said. "The granddaughter they never wanted to meet." The silence in that ballroom became something deeper than shock. It became recognition. Because sometimes truth doesn't need to shout. It simply stands there where everyone can see it. And once people see it, they can't pretend they didn't. You might think the room exploded after that. But it didn't. It went quiet. Not the polite silence people use at formal events, the kind where everyone waits for the next speech. This was the kind of silence that happens when a story people believed for years suddenly breaks open. No music. No clinking glasses. Just 200 people realizing that the family they had admired for decades had been hiding something much bigger than a misunderstanding. My father stood beside me on the stage, his face pale under the ballroom lights. My mother looked like someone had pulled the ground out from beneath her carefully balanced world. Pastor Harrison, who had been standing near the camera for the livestream, stepped forward slowly. "Richard," he said gently, "is what your daughter's saying true?" My father didn't answer right away. For a man who had spent 40 years practicing law, words had always been his strongest weapon. But sometimes the truth leaves no room for arguments. Behind me, Lily's hand slipped into mine. Not because she was afraid, but because she wanted me to know we were standing there together. In the front row, a few guests had already lowered their phones. Others were watching the stage with expressions that had shifted from curiosity to something quieter. Understanding. My brother Nathan stepped forward from the crowd. Then my sister Carolyn. Neither of them looked at our parents. They looked at me, and Nathan spoke clearly enough for the entire ballroom to hear. "She's telling the truth." That single sentence moved through the room like a wave. Because sometimes the hardest part of truth isn't saying it. It's having someone else finally confirm that they saw it too. And in that moment, 20 years of silence began to crack. What happened next wasn't dramatic. No one shouted. No one stormed the stage. But something in the room shifted in a way that was impossible to undo. Because when Nathan said, "She's telling the truth," people stopped seeing this as a family misunderstanding. They started seeing it as a history. My father's shoulders stiffened. "Enough," he said sharply into the microphone. "This is not the time or place for private family matters." The words sounded familiar. I had heard versions of them my entire childhood. "Let's not discuss that here. This isn't appropriate. Family issues stay inside the family." But for 20 years, the truth hadn't been allowed inside the family either. So I spoke again, quietly. "I didn't come here to humiliate anyone." That was important to say, because revenge had never been the point. I came because last week my parents offered me $250,000 to bring a grandson that doesn't exist to this stage tonight. A ripple moved through the ballroom. You could hear the disbelief in people's breathing. I turned slightly toward the crowd. "I refused the money," I said simply. "Because some things are worth more than appearances." Beside me, Lily stood calm and steady. 19 years old. A life my parents had once erased with a single line in a legal document. And suddenly, I understood something clearly. I hadn't come here to destroy my parents' reputation. Their choices had done that on their own. I had come for something much simpler. To stop being invisible. Some of you listening may understand that feeling deeply. Not wanting revenge. Just wanting the truth of your life to exist in the open. So I handed the microphone back to my father. "I'm not asking for anything," I told him quietly. "No money, no apology, No place in your will. Then I looked out across the room one last time. I already built my life. And sometimes, that's the most powerful ending a story can have. Not winning. Not losing. Just standing there, finally seen, knowing you no longer need permission to exist. When Lily and I stepped down from the stage, the ballroom didn't erupt into chaos the way movies usually show moments like that. Instead, people began leaving quietly, one table at a time. A couple near the front approached Lily first. The woman touched her arm gently. "I'm sorry," she said. Not loudly, not for attention. Just softly, the way people speak when they realize they've been part of a story they didn't fully understand. More guests followed. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Some avoided my parents completely. Some simply walked out without saying anything at all. Reputation, I realized that night, isn't destroyed by anger. It dissolves slowly when people see the truth for themselves. Nathan and Carolyn joined us near the ballroom doors. For a moment, none of us knew what to say. 20 years is a long silence to bridge. Nathan finally looked at me and said the simplest thing possible. "I'm glad you came." Not, "I'm sorry." Not explanations. Just acknowledgement. Sometimes that's the first real step towards something better. Outside, the November air felt sharp and clean after the heavy warmth of the ballroom. Lily took a long breath. "Mom," she said quietly, "do you feel different?" I thought about the 16-year-old girl standing in the rain with one suitcase. I thought about Marcus. About Mrs. Torres opening her door. About the years it took to build a life brick by brick. "Yes," I said. "I do." Not because my parents had changed. Not because the past had been repaired. But because for the first time in 20 years, the truth was no longer hidden. And sometimes, that's enough. If you've ever had to walk away from people who refuse to see your worth, you understand how powerful that moment can be. Tell me something in the comments. Would you have gone to that party? Or would you have stayed away completely? I'm always curious how others would handle moments like that. Because stories like this rarely have only one right answer. By midnight that same night, the video was already everywhere. Someone at the anniversary party had recorded the moment I stepped onto the stage. Someone else clipped the live stream from the church broadcast. By morning, the video had been shared hundreds of times. By the end of the next day, it had been viewed tens of thousands of times. I didn't post it. I didn't promote it. The truth simply traveled on its own. Nathan called me Sunday morning. "You should probably stay off social media for a bit," he said gently. "That bad?" "That big," he corrected. He told me what happened after Lily and I left the ballroom. 47 guests walked out within half an hour. The mayor left early without saying goodbye. 2 members of the church board quietly told my father they needed to reconsider some things. When the live stream ended, the comment section was filled with messages from people asking the same question. How could parents do that to their own child? Reputation, my father once said, takes 20 years to build. Sometimes it takes only a few minutes of truth for people to see it differently. But the strangest part of the fallout wasn't the headlines or the conversations happening in Portland. It was what happened here in Seattle. Emails started arriving in my company's inbox. Not design inquiries at first. Messages. Stories. People writing from all over the country saying they had experienced something similar, being pushed aside by family, told to stay quiet, expected to carry shame that was never really theirs. One message stayed with me. A woman wrote, "Your story made me call my daughter tonight after 10 years of silence." I read that message twice. Because if telling the truth helps even one person choose connection over pride, then maybe the pain that started all of this meant something. A few days later, my phone rang again. This time, it was my mother. Her voice sounded smaller than I remembered. "Grace," she said softly. I watched the video. There was a long pause. I didn't recognize the woman standing on that stage. I closed my eyes for a moment before answering. "That's because," I said quietly, "you never stayed long enough to see who I became." The first Thanksgiving after the anniversary party felt different. Not louder, not more dramatic, just fuller. My dining table wasn't particularly large. I had bought it 3 years earlier at an estate sale and refinished the wood myself one quiet weekend while Lily studied for midterms. Usually it seated 6 comfortably. That year we squeezed 12 around it. Lily sat on my right. Eleanor Vance, the mentor who had helped shape my career, sat on my left. Mrs. Torres had flown up from Portland and was happily teaching my nephew how to fold napkins into little swans while Nathan carved the turkey. Carolyn's daughters were arguing over who got the last dinner roll. It wasn't perfect. Families rarely are. But it was real. And for the first time in my life, I realized something important. The family around that table wasn't the one I had spent years wishing for. It was the one that had slowly formed from people who chose to stay. Marcus had been part of it once. Mrs. Torres. Eleanor. My daughter. Even my brother and sister, who were finally trying to repair something they once stayed silent about. My parents weren't there. We hadn't reached that place. Maybe we never will. But I no longer felt like something was missing. Later that night, Lily stood up with a glass in her hand. "I want to say something," she said. Everyone quieted. "When I was little, I used to wonder why our family looked different from everyone else's," she continued. "Mom always told me the truth. She said some people choose reputation over love." She looked at me and smiled. But she also taught me something better. That the family you build can be stronger than the one you were born into. Glasses lifted around the table. And as we toasted, I realized the story that began with a 16-year-old girl standing in the rain hadn't really been about rejection. It had been about rebuilding. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever had to build your life after someone told you that you didn't belong, subscribe and stand for dignity. Because quiet strength deserves to be heard. And somewhere out there tonight, someone listening might still be standing in the rain, wondering if their life will ever change. Trust me, it can.